Okay, good afternoon, everyone, from a warm and sunny New Zealand, and good morning to, or good afternoon or good evening to you wherever you are. My name's Paul Bennett. I'm a portfolio leader for integrated bioenergy here at Scion in New Zealand, and I am currently the chair of IEA Bioenergy. Look, I guess all good things come to an end at some point, and we are now looking at bringing the conference to a close with this final session for our region. It is time to reflect and discuss what we've learned and what we've heard over the last 10 days, and specifically what's happening in this part of the world and what are the implications of what we've heard, either through the presentations related to COP26 or from some of the presentations related to the outputs of IEA Bioenergy, and really think about what are the implications of those are on bioenergy in our countries and in our region. We're going to start with a brief introductory presentation by Luke Pelkmans, the IEA Bioenergy Technical Coordinator, and he'll give some conclusions on, or some preliminary conclusions on what he's heard throughout the last 10 days. We'll then follow that with a series of short presentations from 5 country representatives. Those presentations will be limited to 10 minutes, and I need to ask the panelists, the presenters, to stick to those 10 minutes. And what we really want to get out of them is sort of a brief update of where they are in the country on bioenergy and where they're heading. And the representatives will be coming from China, myself, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and United States. And I'll introduce them all formally later on. So I don't want to take too much time up with preamble. I think we've got quite a busy schedule, but I guess everyone has been on one of these, into one of these sessions before. And so we're going to be using the usual format. I ask everyone, if you've got questions, to enter them in the Q&A box in Zoom. So those are questions of clarification after each presentation, or if you want to ask a more general question to the panel, then enter it there. The Q&A box on Zoom is the only place I will look for questions during this session. But don't forget, we've got the wonder.me app for informal interactions during and after the session, and the question box on the conference website if you want to submit a question, and we'll forward those questions to the presenter. And we'll also have a series of questions, polling questions, to assess audience opinion on some key topics. So with that, I'll ask Ernesto to launch the first poll, please. And the question here is, in which sectors do you expect the highest market expansion of biomass applications in the next decade up until 2030? And so there's 5 options there. Just please click on one, and then we'll review the answers or the opinions later. So that brings me to introduce our first speaker. So as I said, it's Luke Pelkmans, our technical coordinator of IEA Bioenergy. Luke has been with us since 2016 as the technical coordinator. He left Vito and set up his own company, Capria Sustainable Solutions, to manage this interaction. But as I said before, joining IEA Bioenergy, he was with Vito, a Belgian research institute, for about 20 years. At Vito, he studied a range of different topics, including alternative transport fuels and drivetrains, biofuels, bioenergy, and the bio-based economy. So over to you, Luke.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Paul. Let me put up the presentation. Okay, so I'm happy to share with you the highlights of the conference that we had in the past 2 weeks. Just to give you an overview again, so we had 14 sessions in the past 2 weeks. Well, we have the last closing panel. So we're starting one and we have another one about half a day later than this one, where we had the focuses on different topics on certain days. So we started with an opening panel, more looking at the broader energy system and the implications of the COP. Then we had a day where we looked at biomass mobilization and also sustainability governance. On Wednesday, we looked at biofuels with 2 sessions. On Thursday, we looked at green gas, also with 2 sessions. And on the Friday, we had an industry panel, which was also very interesting. And on Monday, then after the weekend, we looked at the circular economy, at biorefining. On Tuesday, on the energy system, including renewable heat. And now we have the closing. So we had quite some sessions. I hope many of you had the opportunity to look at several of these sessions. Of course, they're still available also on the website to look at the recordings. But first, already a big thanks to all the moderators, all the speakers, and all the panelists. So you see all the panels here in the picture that we had so far. So the closing panels are not there yet. So the opening panel, the 2 panels on feedstocks and sustainability, then transport biofuels, green gas, industry panel, circular economy industry, and bioenergy, the energy system. So around 70 people have been really very active in this. And I also want to thank the audience, of course, for your participation and input to the Q&As. I think this was very helpful. We had a look at the figures so far. So more than 1,100 people attended 1 or more conference sessions. So we're really happy with these figures. And it's from around 90 countries all over the globe. So this is really global participation, which we probably couldn't have had if we would have had a physical conference, which we would normally have had without COVID restrictions. Looking at the different sessions, we had between 150 and 400 live participants in each session, which was also very good. And we also noticed that several people also watched the recordings at the session pages afterwards. And this will still be open afterwards after the conference. And we will also advertise a little bit on that. So really pleased about those figures. Now, some highlights more on the content side then. So what has been discussed in the different sessions and what can we conclude a little bit. So first, a few points in the broader sense about the energy transition. This was picked up also at the opening panel, but also in several other sessions as well. First conclusion is that we really need an unprecedented transformation of the energy system to reach the pledges that we hear in different countries to go to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. A lot needs to happen, and then we're talking about efficiency measures, then we're talking about renewables, other renewables than biomass, and also biomass. We're talking about electrification, we're talking about hydrogen, we're talking about carbon capture and storage and utilization. So a lot of options will need it, and we need all of those. And there's really no silver bullets, and we really don't have the luxury to dismiss good options. There's a substantial role for bioenergy in these scenarios. IEA has calculated in their net zero emission scenario by 2050 that biomass would represent around 20% of total energy supply. So this is really substantial. Do mind that the role of biomass will evolve in the coming decades. So biomass applications that we see now, which are more towards electricity and heat, there's some biofuels also, they will probably shift also towards sectors that are difficult to electrify. A message also from IPCC is that CO2 removal from the atmosphere will be really critical to limit global warming, and bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage is one of these critical CDR options. But we need a strong boost to put bioenergy on track. So actually, a lot of the options that IEA has considered are kind of off track to reach this scenario. So we really need to put a strong boost to it, and we need urgent and strong and credible policy actions from governments, also to attract investments and to foster innovation. A positive thing, what we see is that transition is accelerating. So things are really shifting in the minds of peoples and companies. We see companies and sectors really putting down ambitions, clear ambitions in terms of the decarbonization goals. So number of pledges from companies are really growing fast. We see now also that they're trying to translate these roadmaps and pledges into how can we actually do this transition in practice. They also start to recognize that it's not going to be a simple thing. So we need to look beyond simple solutions like sun and wind, which is often in the mind of politicians, which can't solve everything. So we need the different options, and there's no silver bullets. Do mind, that's also a comment that we had in one of the sessions, that in transition periods, companies are vulnerable. So they need to do large investments to make this shift. For those investments, they need a stable policy framework, but also some protection from carbon leakage, so that this may not lead to shifting production to countries with laxer emission constraints. So there's some protection is needed for that. Then going to some of the sessions a little bit. So everything starts with biomass mobilization, of course. And what we see as a trend here also, so far we had kind of a focus on cleaner feedstocks, on clean woods, on also clean crops. But there is now also, we need to move to lower value, to underutilized and heterogeneous biomass resources. Agricultural residues came out as really an important resource also. And in several regions and also in the Asian region, I believe it's really critical also to use that and to stop burning straw on the field, which is leading to a lot of health issues. So that gives also additional benefits in that sense. We also need to connect local and dispersed biomass with what's needed at the bigger scale, so central processing at commercial scale. Certainly, if we move towards aviation fuels or advanced biofuels, or if you move to biochemicals, so we need to make that connection. And we had a session also looking at how biohubs or regional biomass depots can make this connection. So they can provide an intermediate storage, they can make a pretreatment to tradable commodities, and then also add values to residues and allowing income diversification of farmers and small companies, so they don't have to contract the bigger companies directly, but there are also intermediate biohubs doing that for them. In the picture you see, starting from lignocellulose biomass, lots of them, very diverse, and you have to put them together, try to make commodities of them, and then connecting them with the final markets. Sustainability governance is, of course, a very crucial thing for biomass. So we don't want to have unsustainable biomass there, and so, but overall, what was also pointed out is that we shouldn't consider bioenergy in isolation. So bioenergy is part of a broader bioeconomy. It's part of production systems where different products are produced, and often the residues go to bioenergy. So you have to look at this as at a broader level. You also have to look at different issues or different sides of sustainability, and the sustainable development goals of the United Nations are a very good basis for that. So it's not only about energy and climate, and we do see that good practice bioenergy really shows multiple co-benefits. So it can be going towards the rural development, goes to air quality. So there's different aspects that can be very positives. There can be trade-offs as well. So you also need to consider, for instance, biodiversity. So you need to have look for synergies, and also have in mind also the trade-offs that you have, and try to limit negative effects as well. There is more work needed on looking at what's really available at the global or regional scale in terms of sustainable biomass, and what sustainability governance is really working. Also to de-risk new investments in bioeconomy. So it's really also a matter of companies entering here and taking a risk, and they really want to make sure that there is sufficient biomass and that this is sustainable. There's quite a high debate still on the climate impacts of using forest biomass for energy, and there's a lot of studies there. There's different system boundaries which are considered, different counterfactuals. So we really need to consider the proper boundaries and counterfactuals. And we actually have a dedicated webinar, which is really the day after this conference, together with ET Bioenergy and a Swedish company, on the 10th of December, then on really to consider this, and it's still possible to register for this webinar. We had 2 sessions on biofuels, and as mentioned before, there we see a gradual shift there of the attention to difficult to electrify sectors like aviation or marine markets. Now, do mind that there's also the transport. So biofuels are mostly used in the road transport at the moment, and we still need them there. And certainly at the short term, while electric vehicles are kind of in a transition phase, so they are coming up. But of course, vehicles on the market, vehicles which are now new, which are still mostly with internal combustion engines, they are around for 10, 15 years. So we really need that option also there. A lot is moving in aviation and marine markets, a lot of pledges also for net zero emissions also by 2050. For aviation, sustainable aviation fuels are really considered as a cornerstone of decarbonization of the aviation sector. I think SAFs represent around 65% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are needed there. So it's really an important solution there. What's also very positive is that the refining sector, so kind of the petroleum refiners, are also starting to recognize the need to transform and to move away from fossil fuels. So this also gives quite important prospects. And then on the policy side, what we've seen in the past 10, 15 years is that there was mostly volume mandates of blending X% of ethanol or in gasoline or biodiesel in diesel. This is now shifting in more and more regions to greenhouse gas emission reduction mandates, which I think is a positive trend. And what's a bit critical there is that you really need good LCA, you need good background data, good methodology to do these calculations. So that's important. And certification of feedstocks and biofuel pathways is a very important tool to monitor compliance. For green gas, we also had 2 sessions there. Green gas is kind of the biogas or biomethane or renewable hydrogen is also to consider there. Now looking at different markets like the EU, so in Europe and United States, the energy from the gas grid is around 2 times bigger than the energy which comes from the power grid. So this is often underestimated, and we need a lot more attention for the replacement of fossil gas. So it can be in reducing gas consumption, but also in replacing some of the fossil gas by renewable gas. Biomethane is fully compatible with the gas infrastructure. It's one of the major components to decarbonize the gas system. You have different methods to produce biomethane. So you can mostly is now produced from biogas, which is then upgraded to natural gas quality. You can also gasify solid biomass to syngas and then have methane synthesis to biomethane, or you can also have production of e-methane from hydrogen and CO2. There's different benefits from anaerobic digestion systems. So you can avoid methane emissions of residues which normally decompose outside. So you can substitute fossil fuels, you can substitute chemical fertilizers also with the digest co-product, and you can also increase the soil carbon in good systems where you feed back the digestate or biochar to the soil. In the emerging economies, it's also a very important tool, anaerobic digestion. There's multiple benefits, also using farm and livestock waste or household waste for biogas. A clear call also from GBEP was that there needs to be capacity building and training in rural areas to how to operate those systems, and also international cooperation to help developing countries. So this is really a major opportunity to reduce methane emissions globally, which was also one of the commitments at the COP to do now. So we had a few sessions on circular economy, on biorefining. One of the highlights there was that well, processing of waste fractions and unrecyclable waste fractions is no longer only about incineration with energy recovery, but it's really the sector is really looking into emerging pathways like chemical recycling via gasification or liquefaction, so you can produce fuels or chemicals from them. It's emerging, so we still have a lot of power and heat production, and it's also, of course, it's a very good step to do that compared to landfill, but we see things emerging there. Industrial symbiosis was also mentioned in these sessions, where you exchange, where companies at a certain location exchange residue materials and energy flows. This really has important economic, energetic, and environmental benefits. So that's really important to encourage that. We see that these initiatives can grow bottom up, but it's really important that this is enabled by local municipalities, and that's really a trigger really to help companies do that. Biorefineries, very important towards the future, and then also at the moment, they produce a range of bioproducts, including biofuels and bioenergy in an integrated way, which can improve the business case and also gives a higher efficient use of biomass. But you also need policies to transform some of the market environment for biorefineries, particularly for bioproducts which don't have an incentive yet compared to fossil products. So you need tools like a CO2 taxation or CO2 price to stimulate that. We had a session on renewable heat and biomass, and heat is actually, and particularly industry heat is also one of the important sectors for fossil energy consumption. And biomass use for industry heat so far has mainly been in processing industries, which process forestry products or agricultural products, and they use their own process residues for internal heat. But now other industries are also considering biomass to replace their fossil fuel consumption. That this can also give a much higher demand from the industry sector. You can have different solutions, and it all depends on local conditions and on existing technologies, the amount of biomass which is there and the type of biomass which is there. We had some examples in the session looking at the more challenging fuels, so the fuels with higher ash content. It's not ash, it's ash content. And this is also a trend we see. So compared to clean wood chips or pellets, people have to, or industries have to look at the more challenging fuels. A part of this session was about residential wood combustion, which still is an important source of particulate matter emissions, which has also implications on air quality. And it's important to analyze, what can we really do to reduce these emissions. You can have strategies to replace old wood stoves, supporting devices to reduce the emissions like filters. You can have regular on-site inspections, information campaigns for good practice, and things like that. So that is really very important also at the residential level. And the last session was about the contribution of bioenergy to low carbon energy systems. And we see that, well, in many of these scenarios, the energy mix, and particularly the electricity mix, will be not dominated by wind and solar. So the most important characteristics of bioenergy in future will actually be one, flexibility to kind of compensate and balance that. And on the other side, also capturing the carbon and storing this carbon to provide negative emissions. So that's really key characteristics of bioenergy. In terms of flexibility, you can make distinction between long-term and short-term flexibility services provided by energy. So by bioenergy, long-term, think about seasonal heat demand. So you need a lot of heat in winter, but much less in summer periods. You can upgrade biomass to storable renewable fuels, which you can use in different sectors. And then short-term, it's more about balancing in the electricity system, which have increasing variable renewables. What is important is that these flexibility services get a value. So you need to be rewarded for those flexibility services, and that it's not just a matter of what's the cost in dollars or euros per megawatt hour of renewable electricity production, but its flexibility services are also very important. And the last point which was mentioned, so we see that green hydrogen gets a lot of push also these days. There is important interactions, potential interactions and synergies between bioenergy and green hydrogen. So you can have hydrogen using green hydrogen as input in bioenergy systems to boost the production. You can also have the biogenic CO2, which is captured from bioenergy processes, which is then combined with green hydrogen to e-fuels. So there's many options, and in IA Bioenergy, we will also put that high in the agenda in the coming 3 years. Okay, so that's kind of a quick wrap through all the learnings that I kind of considered. There will also be a report of the conference, which goes a little bit more in detail on this. I hope everybody enjoyed the conference sessions, and just to mention that all the presentations and recordings, the session highlights and the poll results will be shortly available at the session pages of the conference website. So thanks again, and I give it back to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luke. I did manage to sit through all the sessions, even the ones that were starting at 3 o'clock in the morning for me. And I think that was a fantastic overview of everything that went on, Luke. So thank you very much for that. I'm not seeing any questions coming through in the Q&A at the moment. So, if you do want to ask any questions to Luke, please post them in there. Whilst we're waiting for people to do that, I've got a quick question for you, Luke. Particularly with regard non-IEA bioenergy presenters or the open panelists, were there any surprises for you in what was said?
Well, surprises, sometimes it's positive surprises. So which I mentioned is that you do see that companies have shifted in the past years. So mentality is shifting. They do recognize the urgency of things that need to be done, and they're also starting to look more and more at biomass also to do that, particularly in industry. So that's one of the things which is really a positive thing also. And of course, you learn with every session. You always learn with some of the smaller points. I think that the co-benefits of like biogas systems, that's and also in emerging economies, that's also a very important item.
Okay, Ernesto, I just saw a comment saying the Q&A does not appear to be open.
It is
open. That something? Okay, I'm seeing questions coming through now. There's a question we can answer online. In terms of one of the areas that drew a lot of attention and it had a very big audience was around the sustainable aviation fuels and the marine fuels, and there seems to be a lot of traction with industry there. But equally, international fuels are currently not included in emissions reporting. So maybe you just want to expand on why there's so much interest in that sector, or those sectors at the moment.
Well, I think I see things coming also from the consumer side. But it is a difficult sector, of course, because it's really internationally organized, and you have to compete at the international level, not at the regional or the national level. So this requires really kind of international agreements to go that way. And I think it's good that this is also considered at the sector level, so at ICAO level for aviation, or the IMO level for marine fuels. But it's not so simple to really put that from the regional sides, or from European or North American or Australian or New Zealand side to impose things. You can start with some mandates in certain airports, of course, but it really needs to be an international effort. But I do favor that this is also reported more apparent in the reporting. So I think this will also come.
Good. Okay, well, we have no other questions online at the moment. maybe I'll keep an eye on that. And if anything specific to you, Luke, comes up, then you can join us, join a panel discussion.
Okay, will do. Thanks.
So let's move on. So now what we're trying to do is get into sort of specific implications in countries. So a bit of an update of what's happening in bioenergy in country, and then implications of where we are with COP26 and some of the findings from IEA Bioenergy. The first speaker is Dr. Dongmin Ren. He is director of the Center of Renewable Energy Development at the ERI Renewable Energy Center in China. So I'll hand the floor to you, Dr. Ren.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And very pleased to attend the closing session. And I will introduce some status about China biomass industry. I will briefly introduce the current status and the new situation and the future choices for the China's bioenergy. For the industry, first I will introduce the biomass power. After the years of development, the biomass power generation industry has primarily achieved the large-scale development, but there exists more problems. As the cost of biomass raw materials rises, the subsidy funds for power generation decrease, and the development of industry goes slow down. The second is the biomass fuels, including 3 parts. One is the biofuel ethanol, one is the biodiesel, another is biomass briquettes. Comparing with the biopower, the biofuel industry development in China has been relatively slow. Also, exists more problems, including high cost of raw materials and barriers to market access. They have seriously affected the further development of the industry. The third one is the biomass gas. It mainly includes biogas and biological natural gas, and the quantity has got a large scale in China. Also, there have some problems. Due to the difficulty of raw material collection, high cost like maintenance and other reasons, most small and medium-sized biogas projects has been abandoned, and the development of biogas is not ideal because of the obstacles for biogas entering the market. Then I will introduce the new situation. President Xi Jinping proposed that China strive for peak by 2030 and strive for carbon neutrality. We call that dual carbon goal. The proposal of a dual carbon target makes the direction of China's energy transformation clearer. And also the proposal of dual carbon target provides opportunities and the power of the development of biomass industry. Also, China have take some actions, such as Action 1. China have launched the national carbon trading market. And in the future, PV, wind power, biomass heating, and power generation projects can develop CCER. The Action 2, China have issued a white paper titled China's Policy and Action to Address Climate Change. It's also stressed that China will vigorously develop renewable energy such as biomass, wind, and solar energy. And the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Ecological and Environment jointly issued a notice on the reduction of environment of biopower projects. The notice stipulates that only biomass power generation projects that meet pollution emission standards can receive state subsidy. I think it means that China's biomass industry will enter a stage of high quality development. And in China, compared to wind solar power, the cost of biomass power generation remains high and has rising trends. In the market of competition, biomass power generation is obviously at a disadvantage. Therefore, it is time for China biomass power industry to make changes. In the future, China have more choices. For biomass energy has many advantages, such as being able to convert into various energy forms, and especially biomass energy has natural carbon neutral characteristics. So I think it can completely update its positioning. Look for new application fields. For example, biomass power projects can be deployed to provide peak shale power in areas rich in wind power and solar energy. Also can be deployed to provide base charge instead of coal in areas where coal power is abundant. Moreover, China could further expand the biomass clean heating market in combination with air pollution control action in northern China, and to expand the application of biomass energy during implementation of the construction of beautiful countryside program. To sum up, China's biomass energy industry has basically achieved large-scale development, but also facing problems such as difficult collection, high cost, barriers to market access, and subsidy withdrawal. The establishment of carbon neutrality target provides a new impetus for the development of biomass energy industry, giving full play to its advantages, realizing diversified development and paying attention to rural energy will be a new choice. That's all. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ren. Thank you very much for sticking to your time and very informative discussion or presentation. Have we got any? I haven't seen any questions. I'll ask you a question. You said development of bioenergy has been a little bit slow in China. What have been the main barriers?
Because in China, all the renewable energy industry should before we got more subsidies from central government, but now we will strive to like the market mechanisms to deploy all the resources. So the withdrawal of the subsidy have make the development slow.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions coming through, but I think I'm going to hold those ones to the panel discussion. One other question for you from me, if I can. You also said biomass is limited in China. Biomass supply is limited. If that is the case, where should it be focused to have the maximum benefit?
There is some
we seem to have a connection problem. Is it just Dr. Ren who has the problem?
Yes, some problems with the network. Okay.
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 So,
okay.
so if biomass is limited, where should it be focused?
Pardon?
You said that biomass is limited in China. Biomass availability is limited in China. If that's the case, which areas of bioenergy should you really be focusing on to get maximum benefits?
For the industry benefits, in the future we should make that very clear and provide more the benefit of carbon reduction.
Okay. Okay. Let's move on to the next presentation, and so that is actually me to give a bit of an overview on what's happening here in New Zealand. I'm just sharing my slides. Hopefully they come through. Can you see my slides?
Yes, not in full presenter's view.
Right. Okay, they should be coming through in full mode now. Right. So I'll give you a bit of an update of where we are in New Zealand with regard to bioenergy implementation and also where we're heading. So just to put this into a little bit of perspective, I thought it was worth giving you a bit of an overview of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions profile. We are a bit unusual. I think the only country that's anywhere like us is Ireland in Europe, where we have a huge agricultural emission, which is largely methane. And we also, so it's about the methane emissions are about the same as the carbon dioxide emissions. And as we know, this net zero commitment is all focused around CO2 emissions. There are other measurements and other legislation around trying to control methane, but the net zero carbon emissions are focused on carbon dioxide or long-lived emissions. And so if you just look at CO2, we actually see that 91% of our CO2 emissions is related to energy use, particularly obviously transport, heat sectors, and a little bit in the power. So where are we in terms of bioenergy penetration into process heat and space heating? We see that bioenergy makes a fairly large contribution. It's about 25% of our energy is supplied through biomass, and that's largely woody biomass. And so that's a good picture. But if we look at transport fuels, it's a bit disappointing, really. So we see very, very little liquid biofuels used in transport. It's less than 0.1% in New Zealand. We've had a few abortive attempts at launching biofuels plants, but none of them have really got off the ground. So a bit of a disappointing picture. And from a power perspective, very little bioenergy used there. We have a large program around renewable power. About 83% of our power is produced from renewable sources. About 50% of that is hydro, a fair chunk of geothermal, and then a growing amount of solar and wind, but very, very limited bioenergy. But on the positive side, things are changing. Things are moving quite quickly, in fact. In 2019, the New Zealand government passed the net zero carbon bill. Within that carbon bill, there was an announcement that we were going to set up a climate change commission. This is a commission that is very similar to the commission that has been in place for many years in the UK. And that commission has roles around setting carbon budgets, giving advice to ministers on how it should achieve those budgets, and then monitoring government progress against the budgets. and monitoring the policies that have been put in place that are designed to try and drive emissions down. So as I said, it was only set up in 2020. They've issued the first set of advice firstly in January this year as draft. There was a consultation period, and then they published the final advice to ministers in May this year, and includes what you would expect: a requirement for more renewables in New Zealand, a requirement to reduce coal and natural gas use, and a requirement to implement biofuels, liquid biofuels. And the government has since responded in October this year with its emissions reduction plan. Again, it's a consultation document, so a range of different entities have responded to that, including ourselves here at Scion. And we're now waiting to see how the government takes on the advice or the consultation documents that it's received, and whether or not it's going to reshape this emissions reduction plan. But two things that sort of happened in parallel and consistent with that trajectory I showed on the previous slide is two specific pieces of policy or policy consultation, I should say, at this stage. We like to have a consultation process here in New Zealand. Everything seems to go through consultation, and but particularly two pieces that are really pertinent to the energy sector. So the first one, we've got a consultation document that was released in, I think it was April this year, around phasing out fossil fuels in process heat. And that's really focused on phasing out coal use in New Zealand, particularly in high temperature heat applications. And there's a target to have no coal used in New Zealand by 2037. That would be about 1 million tons of coal removed from the energy system in New Zealand. It also suggests that there will be no future coal plant installations in New Zealand. And anyone looking at installing new heat plant has to look at alternative sources of energy, including biomass. And natural gas is also used to quite a large extent in the North Island of New Zealand, and there will be plans to phase natural gas out as well. A slightly later time frame than coal, but nevertheless, it's still being slated for phase out. And then we've got a consultation document, I think that was launched in March, around a sustainable biofuels mandate. And within that, there were a series of different recommendations, but it largely focused on greenhouse gas emission reduction targets rather than volumetric targets. And the first target they were talking about was 3.5% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2025. And there will be sort of stiffer targets beyond 2025. Given the timeframes, most of that will be met, I believe, by imports, but there is also some fairly stringent sustainability criteria, and that could drive considerations of domestic production of biofuels. And just to put that perspective, I mean, New Zealand market isn't huge. Depending on which numbers you look at, it's anything from 6 to 8 billion litres, so that's domestic versus full fuel suite. And that would mean around sort of 2.5 to 400 million litres of biofuels being required. Both of these documents, as I said, have been in consultation. I know the biofuels mandate is being considered by ministers now. So the Ministry of Transport have taken all that input to the consultation document, reshaped it, and it's in with ministers now for consideration. Carbon pricing is one of the big things that is driving New Zealand's implementation of bioenergy at the moment, because, as I said, we don't have any specific legislation at the moment. It's all in consultation, but carbon pricing has been around for a while. And in New Zealand, we see, up until during last year, the carbon price was anything from 20 to 35 New Zealand dollars a ton. But as we've started seeing this legislation and net zero emission drive and potential legislation around process heat and biofuels, we've seen carbon prices starting to go up, and they're currently fairly stable at $65 a ton. If you look at the Climate Change Commission's document, they say they think that we're going to need carbon prices of about $140 a ton by 2035 if we're going to be on the trajectory to meet net zero emissions by 2050. And I know for a fact that several companies in New Zealand, big energy companies and big energy users, are using numbers of 140 or to about $160 a ton in their planning assumptions for future investment. If we then look at what the Climate Change Commission said for about 2025, it's saying that they think the carbon prices could be anything from $150 to $250 a ton. That will drive some fairly major shift in thinking amongst corporates. Break-even price for coal, for boiler conversion of coal boilers to wood is about $80 a ton, and we're starting to see that happening now. We're seeing some big heat plant users converting to woody biomass. And as the biofuels mandate that was in place, there was a penalty clause for non-compliance, and that penalty clause equated to $350 a ton. So I think carbon price is going to drive quite a lot of change, and we'll have to wait and see where some of the legislation lands in these consultation documents. In terms of biomass availability, we think we've got plenty to at least start replacing coal from the high temperature heat applications and to make a good start with liquid biofuels. We've got a good handle on how much biomass we have now and how much we're going to have out into the next 30 years, because we know where we've planted our trees, we know when they're going to be harvested. So we've got a good handle on biomass availability, but also within New Zealand, we are exporting 7 million tons of low-grade logs. These are logs that are very knotty, are short or narrow in diameter and wouldn't be processed here in New Zealand. We know that some people are starting to look at these for chipping for bioenergy purposes. And we export wood chip already. There's thinnings to waste, and we're also considering dedicated energy plantations, generally through short rotation forestry. So as I said, that carbon price is driving some industry initiatives. We're seeing forward-thinking companies making steps in advance of legislation. We saw Fonterra, who are a big milk dairy company. They produce a lot of milk powder for export. They started up their first wood pellet plant last year, and I think they're using something like 40,000 tons per annum of wood pellets to dry milk in this one plant. They're now talking about removing coal from all their other plants dotted around New Zealand. New Zealand and MB, one of our ministries, have just joined forces to scope out sustainable aviation fuels, and there is a closed RFP in play at the moment. And we've also looked at one of our only big thermal power stations are now starting to look at biomass supply into that. So just to conclude, New Zealand is a little bit behind the curve, let's be honest, on bioenergy, but there's a lot of really great initiatives out there that hopefully they will come to fruition, and we'll start to see bioenergy implementation accelerate very rapidly. At the moment, carbon price is one of the main drivers, but as I said, those consultation documents will be really interesting to see how the legislation plays out in future. And hopefully some of the outputs from COP will make will provide some further impetus. We're seeing companies move forward ahead of the curve, and I think, you know, international fuels will continue to be at the forefront of what we do here in New Zealand, because we are an export-focused economy. And just to summarize, I think the future is bright here, and the future is green. So thank you. I'd like to try and see if there are any questions specifically for me. No, there aren't at the moment. So we'll save that for later. I think we should then move on to the next presentation. This will be given by Shahana Mackenzie, who's the CEO of Bioenergy Australia. Shahana has a track record of driving public and government and consumer campaigns for non-profit sector over the last 20 years. She joined Bioenergy Australia 4 years ago, and is committed to driving growth in the bioenergy sector and advocating for bioenergy as a key renewable energy solution for the future within Australia. So over to you, Shahana.
Awesome, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you can.
Great. And is that full screen? Does it look fine?
It looks good.
Woohoo, winning. Well, look, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this session. Delighted to be here. I suppose what I decided to focus on today was really around the release of Australia's first bioenergy roadmap. So we, Bioenergy Australia, we are the industry association for Australia's future bioeconomy. We advocate, campaign, inform and connect. We run a number of alliances across the country, including the Renewable Gas Alliance, the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. We draft submissions to government. We advocate for favourable policy. We run events. We do all sorts of things in this space. When I joined Bioenergy Australia in 2017, it wasn't involved or engaged in informing positive policy solutions that would support the development of Australia's bioeconomy. But we feel like we're starting to change that, and certainly things are moving in the right direction. Our members range from anything you could imagine that really sits in this space. So major airlines, engineering firms, developers, technology providers, finances, universities, state government bodies, really anything and everything you could imagine. And we've had a 300% growth in our membership since 2017. So I suppose to focus on the thing that is most exciting and the best Christmas present I've ever had, Australia's first bioenergy roadmap was released 2 weeks ago. We advocated for the development of Australia's bioenergy roadmap in the lead up to the last federal election in Australia. So that was back in 2018, 2019. It was announced in 2019 that it would be taking place, and it has just recently been released. So that roadmap was developed by the Australian government, and it was released by the Australian Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. So for us, the really positive part about the roadmap is that this isn't a roadmap from industry. This is the government's roadmap. So for us to now utilise that information contained within the roadmap and the opportunities that have been presented, it's very easy for us to now sell the story of why governments in the future should be investing in this space, and particularly across those areas that have been identified. Now, what the roadmap showed was 4 key themes, and they were enabling market opportunities in the hard-to-abate sectors, enabling opportunities where bioenergy can complement other low-emission alternatives, developing our resources, and building supportive ecosystems. Now, for us, I'm going to focus on the enabling the hard-to-abate sectors, because that's really where we see, if I was to look at where do I think Australian governments are going to invest in bioenergy into the future, it's going to be in the areas that are the hardest to abate. So those that are going to have the longest term opportunities in Australia. So the three areas that were identified in the hardest to abate are industrial renewable heat, sustainable aviation fuels, and renewable gas grid injections, so biomethane for gas injection. Now, the really interesting point that came out of this was that by 2030, what the roadmap showed was that 33% of industrial heat could be supplied by bioenergy, 18% of Australia's aviation fuel, and 23% of our total pipeline gas market, which they are huge figures, really, in terms of what that opportunity represents. So what we've then taken from this in terms of here in Australia and the opportunity that bioenergy presents for the Australian economy, our emissions and everything else, the way that we frame this in terms of now the engagement we have across state government bodies, allied industries that should be considering bioenergy, but also in the lead up to another federal election, which is due to happen in May probably of next year, this is what Australia's bioeconomy could look like in terms of its broader contribution. So by 2030, the roadmap showed that it could be contributing 10 billion additional annual GDP. It could be creating an additional 26,000 jobs, a 9% reduction in emissions, and a 27 additional days of fuel security coverage for Australia, which for anybody who knows anything about Australia and our politics, we're down to 2 oil-based refineries in this country, and that's seen a significant closure of oil refineries over the last sort of 5 to 7 years, and we're now down to only 2, with 2 having closed during the COVID period. So that figure for us is a really important one. And then a 6% reduction in waste as well. So feedstocks. Another really interesting thing for us is that based on what we have available, according to the Bioenergy Roadmap, that 40% of Australia's current primary energy supply could be supplied at 10 times the current amount that's being supplied could be from bioenergy. So once again, a huge figure that is a government figure. This is something coming from the Australian government. So that's it for me. I wanted to keep it short because I'm hoping that there's going to be a lot more in terms of Q&A. So in terms of, I suppose now for bioenergy and particularly for Bioenergy Australia, our focus is now really on driving those proposed outcomes, those opportunities within the Bioenergy Roadmap and making it happen. It's been 2 years waiting for this roadmap to come out so that we can now really focus and align industry and drive really strong outcomes. And that is now where we're at. So Paul, that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Any questions coming through specifically for you? There's a question coming through. My company was just in SBC Australia Decarbonise. We are funded by US DOE for marine biomass. So is there anything happening in marine biomass in Australia?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the announcements that also came along with the Bioenergy Roadmap, with the release of the Bioenergy Roadmap, was an announcement of $33 million for marine and aviation specifically, so those 2 particular areas. So our expectation is that there will be some further detail relating to that early in the new year around how that will be utilised, whether that funding will be available for feasibility studies or pilot programs or other pieces of work. So we don't yet know. Marine obviously has been identified as a supporting technology or a supporting market for other areas where other opportunities exist in terms of decarbonisation. But we see marine and renewable diesel in terms of heavy haulage as well as really big opportunities in Australia.
Yeah, no, I think we're in the same place. I think the question though was specifically around the use of marine biomass, so seaweed, as a feedstock.
Yeah, so look, that has been included in the technology investment roadmap at a broader level.
Yeah.
In terms of, I suppose, the bioenergy roadmap was really seeking to be a very practical, on the ground, what can we be doing now? What are the areas that we should be focusing on now? And a little bit more of a focus, I suppose, on those markets and those opportunities within those markets. So the feedstock mapping is really around feedstock availability currently. It isn't looking at longer term opportunity around new feedstocks coming online. So I would say that, look, absolutely, that's an opportunity into the future. But what we wanted to make sure with the bioenergy roadmap was that it was an assessment of current. It wasn't going to be able to be criticised broadly for being too wide in its scope and its opportunity, and able to be challenged. So, and also for us, I mean, in terms of feedstock availability, we have so much right now. I mean, similarly to New Zealand, right? Like we have a lot of feedstock available. It's just around what's the best process that we should be undertaking in order to capitalize on that.
Good. Okay, great. Why don't you just hang on there, and we'll have a look at the answers of the first poll. Maybe you can comment on what you see.
Sure.
There we go.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite interesting, isn't it, that you've got green gas and liquid biofuels as the two sort of front runners, which have obviously come out in terms of the bioenergy roadmap as the two of the largest areas for us as well. Yeah.
Yeah, for us in New Zealand, I mean, liquid biofuels is clearly an area that we really want to focus on, particularly those hard to decarbonize sectors such as marine and aviation. But equally, you know, removing coal from heat plant is a very easy process, and we can do that now. So I'm surprised to see the industrial heat one is quite so low.
And I wonder if that's a reflection of where other countries are already sitting, right?
Yeah,
so in Australia, where we're sitting, we currently, you know, we're completely underutilizing bioenergy for heat, and it could be a significant contributor. So we see it as a really big opportunity and a really big growth area. But for countries, particularly European countries and the like, that's obviously an area that is far well progressed compared to us. So perhaps that's more of a reflection of where participants are coming from in the areas that are greatest sort of opportunity for growth.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe we'll discuss this one further during the panel session at the end. But thank you, Shahana. Let's have the second poll, please. And so the question is, what would be the most important policy measures to support biomass applications? And in this poll, you can select up to 2. Whilst you're doing that, let me introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Asharda Mendes. He's Deputy Director of Clean Fuels Portfolio at Natural Resources Canada. And he's also an executive committee member of IA Bioenergy. So for more than a decade, he's worked in the energy industry, spanning both private and public sectors. His experience includes working for a small advanced startup in the biofuel sector, Aviation Corporation, and to the world's largest oil and energy company at the time, ExxonMobil. So I'll leave any further introductions to you, Asharda, and hand the floor to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. Can you see my screen and hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
Both.
Okay, well, thank you for the introductory remarks, and to IA Bioenergy in general for having me on this panel. And good evening to those on Eastern Time, and morning and afternoon to everyone else. In Canada, bioenergy is and will continue to be an important part of the energy mix. Canada has a large supply of renewable forest biomass, as well as access to forest industry byproducts and residues. In fact, Canada is the 3rd most forested country in the world by area, And being a large country, Canada is fortunate to have over 347 million hectares of forest, which is equivalent to about 9% of the world's forests. Now, as for bioenergy, it currently represents about 5% of Canada's total energy supply. A large majority is solid biofuels, which are used for heat and electricity. However, note the use of biomass for liquid biofuels is trending up. Now, the IEA lays out 4 key pathways to achieve deep decarbonization: electrification, hydrogen, CCUS, and bioenergy. And given that bioenergy is applicable in all energy sectors, as my colleagues mentioned earlier, electricity, direct heat, and transport, it can also be easily integrated into existing infrastructure and can even deliver negative emissions when linked to carbon capture and sequestration. So I am certainly expecting the overall contribution by bioenergy to Canada's energy mix. Now, we have seen there are a lot of opportunities, but first we need to address the challenges. So first, I would say technology. I think significant research, development, and demonstration is still required to lower the cost and increase the efficiency of modern bioenergy conversion pathways. Second is risk for developers and investors. There is a high uncertainty in financial returns, lack of consistent and reliable feedstock in certain situations, and also in some settings, misaligned or non-existent codes, standards, and regulations. And lastly, cost. While costs are coming down, bioenergy still comes at a premium compared to its fossil fuel alternatives. But now for the good news. Many countries, including Canada, are making concerted efforts to create opportunities for bioenergy. These come in 2 forms: government policies, which strive to increase market pull, and support for research, development, and demonstration, which is a push type incentive. So now on to Canada. Like I mentioned, very large country, has 10 provinces and 3 territories. As such, energy and the environment is a shared responsibility. But given that I work for the federal government, I'll speak more to the national policies in place. And historically, this conversation starts with the Canadian Environmental Protection Act in 1999. But the more recent developments start in 2016 with the Pan-Canadian Framework. This was the first ever national climate plan that was developed with provinces, territories, and in consultation with Indigenous peoples. And high-level goals are to meet Canada's emissions reduction targets, grow the economy, and build resilience to a changing climate. And last year, this was built upon with the release of the Strengthened Climate Plan. And this plan includes 64 new federal policies, and programs to pollution, build a stronger, cleaner, more resilient, and inclusive planet. And once this plan is fully in place, Canada will be on a path to exceed our Paris targets in 2030 and further be net zero by 2050. Now, to support bioenergy use, there are federal and provincial renewable fuel regulations which mandate minimum renewable fuel blending. And this varies across the country from 5 to 10% in gasoline and 2 to 5% for diesel. And there are planned increases that will push the renewable content in gasoline in some provinces to as high as 15% by as early as 2025. And next, I'll jump into an upcoming regulation. The Clean Fuel Regulations, formerly the Clean Fuel Standard, is similar to other low carbon fuel standards, where it requires a reduction in the life cycle carbon intensity of liquid fuels. And the goal is to reduce GHG emissions by 20 megatons annually by 2030. This policy was announced in 2016 and has undergone numerous consultations with stakeholders. The draft regulations were published in late 2020, and comments will be integrated, and final regulations will be published in spring of next year, with enforcement to start December of next year. Next, the carbon pollution price. Canada's government believes that a price on carbon pollution is an essential part of Canada's plan to fight climate change and grow the economy. As such, in 2016, carbon pricing was announced and the federal benchmark was set. This was formalized in 2018 with the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. And while provinces can create their own plan, it needs to meet the federal benchmark to be permissible. The price is $40 per ton now, and starting in 2022 will increase by $15 a year to a target of $170 per ton by. Now on to technology push. Support for innovation is a necessary complement to regulatory measures. And I believe the federal government has a critical role in accelerating the development of bioenergy technologies. The private sector cannot be expected to drive optimal levels of investment in bioenergy, RD&D, due to a variety of market barriers. And fortunately, it appears my bosses have felt the same for some time. There are various types of government support that have been provided in Canada for biofuels, spanning across all stages of the supply chain. And as you can see here, there are many government and arm's-length government departments that play a role in the space, right from fundamental research through technology development, commercialization, export, and trade. Two of the notable programs include the $1.5 billion Clean Fuels Fund, which was established to de-risk capital investment required to build new or expand existing clean fuel production facilities. Support is also available for feasibility and front-end engineering design studies, and the establishment of biomass supply chains to improve logistics for the collection, supply, and distribution of biomass materials, feedstock in clean fuel production facilities. Resources are also available to address gaps and misalignment in codes, standards, and regulations related to the production, distribution, and next, the Strategic Innovation Fund's Net Zero Accelerator will provide up to $8 billion in support of projects that will enable Canada to reduce its domestic greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the three key streams is clean technology and industrial transformation, which of course includes advanced. Now to finish off, I'd like to highlight a few Canadian success stories that are really putting Canada on the path to net zero. First, Covenant Energy recently announced the first commercial renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel refinery in Canada. This is expected to be producing in 2024. And given Canada has no production and imports around 400 million liters per year, this is definitely a welcome addition. Next, Canada being so expansive has many remote communities, which are almost exclusively powered by diesel generators. Huaracha is now producing some of their own heat and power from wood chips made from an abundant supply of pine beetle killed trees. And this is the first known off-grid utility application of biomass gasification to electricity in Canada. And lastly, Enerchem is the first company in the world to produce renewable methanol and ethanol from non-recyclable, non-compostable municipal solid waste at full commercial scale. Their solution replaces the use of fossil sources like petroleum and natural gas to produce sustainable transportation fuels and chemicals that are used in a broad range of everyday products. And Enerchem has one commercial plant in the commissioning stage in Alberta, one that will start commissioning in 2023 in Quebec, and two that are pending FID in the Netherlands this year. Now, these are just a few of many. And I think, as Paul mentioned, the future for bioenergy could not be brighter or greener. And personally, I'm excited to see what the future holds in Canada and around the world. Thanks. That's it for me, Paul.
Thank you very much, Asharda. A quick request from me. Can New Zealand companies and researchers apply for the 1.5 billion or 8 billion funds? Joke.
for that fund specifically, but if you were collaborating with a Canadian entity, then that would be possible.
Okay, great. Oh, I'll make a note of that. Thank you. Quick question for me, because I'm not seeing many coming through on the Q&A. So I guess it's the federal government owns the net zero target within Canada. How is that sort of distributed and promulgated by the individual provinces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, it is a shared responsibility, and as part of the overall climate plan, there has been some net zero regulations that have been passed, and this provides 5-year targets that have been set. Unfortunately, there's no teeth per se to these regulations. They are just high-level objectives for now, but given a new government has recently formed in Canada, we expect some more teeth, as I would put it, to come down on these objectives for us.
So the federal government will be able to sort of say to a provincial government either, you know, what you're planning here isn't adequate, or what you planned you're not meeting, and therefore we'll come down with a hammer on you.
I think a good example is the carbon pollution pricing. There were some provinces that pushed forward an idea not to participate, and the Supreme Court in Canada actually said, given that the climate crisis is a federal issue, that the federal government could set carbon pricing targets that provinces would have to follow. So I think that's a good example of what's to come.
So we got 2 specific questions just come through for you, Asharda. In terms of enabling new supply chains, what is the role of Canada Rail?
Canada Rail, that's a great question. I think it has a large part to play, just given Canada is so expansive, and that to get feedstock to a refinery, we talk about leveraging economies of scale, and to make that radius really economical and environmentally friendly. I think rail is a great option, especially that rail companies are pushing forward with their own environmental agenda. I know that Ballard, a hydrogen fuel cell company in Canada, has put fuel cells onto trains in other parts of the world. I want to say France. And there are the major rail company in Canada is also looking at renewable diesel. So I think combining, economies of scale for plants as well as greening up rail applications, that's going to be a great combination.
Okay, and there's one other question, but maybe you can answer that sort of in the chat or the Q&A. It's around someone wanting some more details about the quadrature model. And
Sure.
so if you've got a case study of that, maybe you can just either give them or put your email address in there, and then that you can send it. Okay, let's move on to our final panelist, and that's Jim Spaeth. Jim serves as the Systems Development and Integration Program Manager for US DOE. He's in the Bioenergy Technologies Office, or BETO for short. His current portfolio includes DOE investment into integrated biorefining projects focused on the development of advanced biofuels and bioproducts, including aviation fuels and marine biofuels. Jim leads the international bioenergy efforts for DOE and is currently chair of the BioFuture platform and was the previous chair of IEA Bioenergy as well. So over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Paul. So going last is not necessarily an advantage, but it was great to see the presentations from the other speakers. And I think there's a lot of commonality between the priorities, in particular between the US and Australia and Canada. So you'll see some common themes here. It's been an exciting year in the US with the new president. He was signed in on January 20th. It seems like longer than that because it's been such a busy year with exciting and great interest in clean energy development and the environment. Earlier this year, the president committed the US to 50% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, which is going to be a very aggressive goal. And by 2050, having 100% clean energy across the economy. Other goals include decarbonized electricity by 2035, 100%, and decarbonizing essentially all of the sectors, transportation, energy intensive industries, buildings and agriculture. And to do this, it requires really a great amount of growth in these industries, not just R&D. So there's an intent to prioritize deployment over R&D in the next decade or so. Across the economy in the US, transportation makes about a third of all the emissions, followed by electric power and then industry. And the graph on the right shows the trends going out to 2050 based upon the US Energy Information Agency, that transportation will have the highest amount of emissions and will grow slightly, followed by industrial applications, with electric power becoming cleaner over time. In particular, in transportation is the area that the bioenergy program within DOE has its major focus. So as we see going out to 2050 in the graph on the left, automobiles and light duty vehicles are supposed to make up over 50% of all the energy use by 2050. So that is a very large growth. For light duty vehicles, those are expected to be largely electrified, but there'll be a lot of growth in trucking, aviation, and marine. And in these hard to electrify sectors, as had been mentioned by other speakers, aviation, marine, and heavy duty vehicles, that is where the US Bioenergy program is focusing most of its efforts, its research, and its funding. And we think within the US itself, approximately 60 to 70 billion gallons of these advanced biofuels can be produced in that 2050 timeframe. And it's not just transportation fuels that bioenergy and biomass can contribute to, but it can also contribute to displacing chemicals. There's a lot of interest in biochemicals, biomaterials, and it can displace up to 20% of the industrial sector. So there's tremendous hope here and tremendous economic opportunity and potentially larger financial return than in the transportation sector. As we know, fuels are a tough commodity market. And there's also great opportunity for biomass to contribute to reducing emissions in the agricultural sector, in forests and sustainable agriculture, and in manure and various waste management. So continuing on the theme as these hard to electrify sectors, in particular, sustainable aviation fuels has become the #1 priority in the US for the bioenergy program. And to emphasize this, back on September 9th, only a couple months ago, there was a major White House event rolling out what we're calling the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Grand Challenge. This is a government-wide effort. It's not just the DOE. We're working in partnership with, for example, NASA, the Department of Transportation, the US Department of Agriculture, and EPA, focused on these goals. So goals including a 50% reduction in GHG compared to conventional fuels, and sufficient SAF to meet 100% of aviation fuel demand by 2050. And a more near-term goal, though, is 3 billion gallons of SAF by 2030. So this is going to require great expansion of the sustainable aviation fuel industry. Recently, there's been tremendous growth in the renewable diesel industry, but not as much focus on sustainable aviation fuel, though we know a lot of these plants can produce both. And currently, there's a policy misbalance here that favors renewable diesel. And there are bills in Congress being considered right now that can change that and provide some more impetus to sustainable aviation fuels. And we hope they come to pass. To get those 70 billion gallons or so, we need approximately 1 billion tons of biomass across many, many different sources. So all of these different types of feedstocks and these different conversion pathways need to be fully developed and fully exploited. To get to the 3 billion goal by 2030, 3 billion gallon goal, that can probably largely be met by renewable, by HEFA, and possibly alcohol to jet. But beyond that, and looking at the graph on the right-hand side of the screen, and thanks to Task 39 and their excellent reports on sustainable aviation fuels, this just lists at a high level the various technologies that need further development and over the timeframes over which that may come to pass. And so finally wrapping up what this panel is supposed to be about, and this will be a repeat of some themes of my colleagues on this panel. What are the major challenges to bioenergy success? Well, first off, we really need to establish that very wide range of feedstocks and the supply chains. We need to make conversion technologies much more efficient, reduce the costs, improve these various technologies, and make them viable end-to-end in the various integrated systems. And we need a broader acceptance of bioenergy as being sustainable. And then we need enabling policy, both policy that incentivizes production as well as market pull, similar to what Asharda just mentioned. Beyond that, if all of those other factors come to place above, then we need widespread investment for this to become real. And the final ingredient I would say is that we really need global collaboration. These technologies are going to be shared across the world. There's partnering going on from country to country, and companies are usually not staying in any one country. They're spreading out far and wide. So I think all of these factors, they're very complicated, easy to talk about at a high level, very complicated to make successfully, will contribute to global deployment. And thank you, Paul. That's my brief presentation.
Thank you very much, Jim. Very clear. I've got a quick question for you because it's something that we're grappling with here in New Zealand as well. And you mentioned policy misbalance between SAF and other fuels. And I was just wondering what sort of policy instruments are you looking at to try and address that and to try and get people to focus more on SAF production?
Currently, to talk about the current policy in place is that most of the new production is focused on the California LCFS market. And there's greater credit, and which translates to financial value for the renewable diesel market than SAF at the moment. But at the congressional level, at the federal level, they're looking at creating a production incentive of between $1.50 to $2 a gallon based upon the CI score. So the higher the CI score, above 50%, the more credit you get. And they're also considering an investment tax credit to help get those plants established. Currently, sadly, the language is only showing a 5-year timeframe for that. And we know that that will not be near enough to establish this industry. It needs to be in place for much longer than that. And I think everyone realizes that and realizes that this is just the initial round, and it'll need to be continued most definitely for more than a decade to get this industry really going.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Longevity of legislation is really critical, I think, because we've suffered here in New Zealand with sort of mandates or incentives being put in place for biofuels and then being removed for by the next government, and that just sort of creates uncertainty. Even now, even with some of the legislation that seems to be on track, there's still that uncertainty about, well, will the next government pull this legislation? So longevity of legislation is really important. Absolutely. Hey, I'm not seeing any questions specifically for you, Jim, but let's pull up the responses to the second poll, and then I invite you to share your thoughts on this, Jim.
This is a tricky one. I struggle myself with this question, but I think I answered it the way the majority did. We've currently had obligations as the main stimulus for biofuels in the US, but we really want to move towards essentially carbon credit for carbon reduction. So essentially like the LCFS, we're hoping it's currently being adopted by many other states, and it's certainly the model that is being considered for across the US. A tax on fossil fuels would be great, but I think in particular in the US, it may be very difficult to get that passed. So, and definitely we need support for research and development, which is what my department focuses on. Yeah,
no, I think I totally agree with you in terms of, you know, where we are in New Zealand. We've had a carbon tax or carbon pricing for a long time, and it's been reasonably successful, and it looks to be what's behind the acceleration at the moment, and the discussion around obligations and legislation as well is driving where we are at the moment. So I concur with that, but equally support the fact that, you know, we need more research and development and demonstrations of these new technologies. So that's good. Thank you very much, Jim. Let's have the third question. And then, so there we go. In which bio-based field is most research required? And here again, please select 2. And we'll discuss this in sort of about 10 minutes or so. So now I sort of invite all the panelists to put on their video and they unmute themselves. And Shahana, Doming. Here they go. Doming, please put on your camera and unmute yourself. But let's get going. Yeah, this discussion, let's make it fairly free flowing. I'm happy for any of the panelists to ask a question of the other panelists, rather than me sort of trying to just direct questions to you 5. But let's start with one of the key questions was around, you know, we heard right in the opening panel discussion from Paolo Frankel that bioenergy is critical to meeting the net zero carbon targets around the world. But his other message was, we really need to accelerate implementation of bioenergy. So what are the barriers? What are the hurdles? Why aren't we moving forward as quickly as we should be? Because we all know it's needed. Let's pick on Asharda. Do you want to start?
Happy to.
What are the barriers? Why aren't we moving forward more quickly?
Yeah, I think there's a sad truth that everyone realizes we need to move ahead to do our part for climate change, but nobody wants to pay for it. And so when what we need to do as working in this industry is really bring the cost down or support with government incentives so the premium on fossil fuels is palatable to the everyday consumer. I think that's probably the biggest one in my mind.
Anyone else have a
If I could jump in, I think an element of why it's not being as robustly invested in at the moment is unfortunately some lack of success between, say, the early 2000s and 2015. A lot of attempts at commercial biorefineries that have not been successful. Sometimes the feedstock is just so intransigent, so difficult. And so sadly, there is a spotlight being shined much more brightly on other technologies at the moment that we're competing with. Hydrogen in particular, and electrification, and CCS, I would say. And happy to let others jump in.
Johanna?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said so far. And I think also probably one of the problems that we have within the industry itself is the industry competing against itself and discrediting itself. That we have elements of the industry that have said, oh, you know, we shouldn't be investing in first generation ethanol because that's going to be sending the feedstock in that direction when we really need it to be going in this direction. It's like if as an industry, we can't sort of come together and say, let's just grow the pie collectively, then, you know, we don't need external support in not progressing if we're going to be internally arguing. And I think following that, you know, what other renewable can be a replacement for all fossil base? You know, we're trying to spread ourselves across every single element. And in doing so, I mean, for myself, you know, being only in the industry for the last 4 years, I spend the first half hour in a meeting with someone explaining to them what bioenergy is in order to sort of cover it all off. And so, you know, we're kind of misunderstood and not understood. And so I think there's just an easy kind of write-off that it's just in the too hard basket sometimes for people to deal with.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest sort of misconceptions of bioenergy being misunderstood is around sustainability and whether or not biomass is sustainable. Because you burn it, it releases CO2. What's the difference between that and fossil fuel? So, there had been a lot of work done by IA Bioenergy to address that, and Luke in particular on that. Have you got any thoughts, Luke, on barriers?
Yeah, it's indeed one of the critical things, actually, the image and the difficulties and perceptions on biomass, that it's so difficult to make it sustainable. Indeed, as Jim said, spotlight on other solutions. So people seem to look for the silver bullet. They really think that one solution like electric cars or hydrogen can do it. And focus everything on that, but you need to look at the broad spectrum, and that you have all kinds of fossils that in all kinds of sectors that you need to replace, and they all need kind of different approaches sometimes, and that's why I think it's also good for bioenergy to focus on these difficult to abate sectors, so that we really have an argument there that, well, this is really something where we can make a difference, and it's more difficult for others to do that.
So what do we need to do to change the perception of bioenergy and to make it more palatable to policymakers, to the general public, to industry, to investors? What do we need to do to change the image?
Well, I think
go ahead. Whoever started.
Well, I think, okay, so from our perspective, what we're doing in Australia is we're not using the term bioenergy moving forward. So we're focusing on the markets. So renewable gas, sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel. So for us, in terms of, we're going to really try and focus moving away from that broader brand of bioenergy. And we're going to really focus our energy behind these kind of market opportunities and really push those as hard as we possibly can. And hopefully in doing so, gain a lot of traction within those individual spaces. So that's, from our perspective, that's the approach that we're taking as the industry body.
Are you going to change your title from Bioenergy Australia to something else?
No, but we have the Renewable Gas Alliance. So that has its own brand, that has 50 organizations that sit underneath it. And you will start to see things coming out from the Renewable Gas Alliance instead of it coming out from Bioenergy Australia. Similarly, we have the Cleaner Fuels Alliance. We have the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Alliance. So you'll start to see that there'll be more of a focus on those brands and information coming directly. So individual websites for each of those different things, and really us trying to target and push, instead of, as I said, having to have that half-hour conversation of convincing someone that I'm not talking about, E10 from 1997 that has problems with carburetors, like it's sort of, let's move on.
Yeah. Jim, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I really like that tact that Shahana just mentioned, and maybe we'll have to try to capitalize on that. But I do think that we can't hide behind these labels. There is a very strong anti-bioenergy faction out there that I believe we have to have direct dialogue with, based upon science and real science and facts. And I know the IEA Bioenergy TCP, in particular, Task 45, has been very, very active in that area, and I think very effective. And the BioFuture platform has that whole area of debate as a priority that we want to work very closely with the TCP and other organizations like GBEP on. And I'm wondering, though, in particular in Europe, is bioenergy going to be given a fair shake, given the very strong anti-bioenergy campaigns that you see, in particular anti-forest bioenergy? And perhaps
maybe Luke can respond to that.
Yeah, I think there's a real risk that it's ending a little bit in the background also, and also the discussion comes from countries which don't have much biomass, so they have kind of parks or only parks. I'm based in Belgium, and here it's also the case. So people are very sensitive if you cut a tree, because they kind of familiar that they don't want to lose that tree that's there. So they kind of extrapolate this idea also to the rest of the world that, well, you shouldn't cut a tree anywhere. So I think, yeah, I think countries really have to look at their own situation also, and that's also what you see in Europe, is that countries which have sufficient feedstocks, that they are coming to defend that case also, that they say, well, this is creating enormous opportunities also for us to do something with it, and probably that case will be very important. But you will see countries like in Belgium more looking at maybe residues, but also looking at at capturing CO2 from industries, looking at the waste sector, things like that, but less to really mobilizing local biomass. But yeah, I think every country will be different, and I think what's really good to see in the countries that you have shown here is that you see this local potential of biomass, and also creating local economic opportunities also with mobilizing that, and you also have this rural development area, which is very important.
Yeah, no, and I think even in New Zealand we have a problem around sort of one of the most frequently asked questions is, do we have enough biomass? And you know, we've got swathes and swathes of plantation forestry, FSC accredited forestry, and people are sort of still questioning us, do you have enough? Yet we're happy to pursue hydrogen or electrification of everything, when only sort of 15% of our total primary energy would sort of translate into sort of power generation. So it's interesting, and I don't understand why we've got such a negative perception. Let's have a look at the third poll if we can, the results of the third poll, and then we can discuss that.
Paul, can I just add to that? Because
Please.
I think what you just said in relation to hydrogen and electrification is really important. And I think I remember a chairman of ours once said that we will know that we have succeeded in bioenergy when we have the oil industry advocating on our behalf. And that for us is what has happened with hydrogen, right? So the moment that we start to see really strong investments and strong strategic plays from the fossil-based players in our space, then I think things will change. That's the reason why hydrogen is being focused on so much, is because it's an opportunity for diversification for the fossil. So I think it's, you know, is there a way that we can become more attractive to that environment?
Yeah, it's also, if I can pick up on that, that was also some of the things which is also interesting in one of the sessions, is that the refining sector in Europe is really coming forward, that they say, well, biomass is one of the feedstocks that we need to replace oil. So I know they're also pushing hydrogen, because that also links to the gas industry, which with CCS and CCU, and they can sell it. But they clearly have biomass and renewable fuels in their portfolio now for the future. And of course, that also brings, you now get a fight between the refining sector and the electric vehicle proponents, because they don't like renewable fuels. But anyway, this oil industry thing it's interesting also that you see that they're also picking it up.
Yeah, I'm conscious that we still don't have Domin on in this panel. Domin, if you can hear me, please unmute yourself and switch on your video so you can participate in this panel. That would be really good. The responses to the third question, the poll third question, had just come up. Maybe Asharda, you want to just have a look at them, and sort of your initial thoughts would be great.
Yeah, happy to. I think I couldn't agree more with the top choice. Conversion processes definitely need work, especially, you know, as the IEA states, we need to start producing negative emission technologies, and I think CCS plus bioenergy is a great candidate for that. And then I think the equity amongst the other answers just shows that RD&D for the entire supply chain, or for the entire value chain, needs work. You know, there isn't one process that's going to solve all our problems. And even And even when there is, different parts of it need work as well. So this is not surprising at all.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Let me just run through some of the questions that are starting to come in. We've got 5 minutes to run, so let's get some quick answers. How long is the usual biomass fuel supply and purchase agreement? So this is particularly focused around power plants where, you know, they might have a 30-year arrangement for fuel. So how much is typical, anyone? So in New Zealand, I'm aware of people looking at wood chip supply on a 10-year long-term contract. I don't know whether that's consistent with other parts of the world.
And I think the interesting part, and this is something a challenge for us in Australia, is what is the contract you can get, and then what is the requirement that investors have in order for them to invest in a project, in terms of having a level of understanding around security of supply of feedstock, because usually those two things are not aligned.
Yeah, agreed. We have another question around scaling of approaches, so taking sort of what's happening in the US and translating it into some smaller countries such as New Zealand around the world. How do we scale technologies? Anyone want to have a go at answering that one? Jim, Luke?
I think that a lot of collaboration and partnering can help success. We've seen a number of cases where technologies have been developed in the US or Canada, and then we see them being deployed in Brazil or elsewhere, sadly, because perhaps our incentives are not as strong as some of these other countries. But that's certainly a model that I've seen be successful, not a model that we're trying to support in the US. We'd like to see some of this building going on in the US, of course.
I think there is also merit to that argument that to go against economies of scale and to really use that hub and spoke model, where separate companies specialize in whatever part of the value chain they're experts in. So for an example, you know, really narrow biomass supply chains, and then there's one company that does the initial separation into, let's say, solids and the liquids, and then those liquids go on to another company that can specialize in the conversion of cellulose to glucose, then send it off to somebody who can do that fermentation. And I think that can support smaller countries as well, where, you know, you don't need to be doing everything. You can do something a bit smaller that you could start.
Yeah, and we saw some great examples during the integrated bioenergy session earlier on this week, which sort of speaks to that exactly. There was a question around, you know, what policy goals, what policy targets, or policy implementation should we have in mind for SAF?
We've just commissioned a report which is due for release probably early in the new year, and it's called Sustainable Aviation Fuel Bridging the Price Gap. And you're aware of this, Paul, because you sit on our SAFA Alliance. And mandates have been shown to be, through the process that we're going through, that mandates, which funnily enough, when we first had this conversation with the airlines back in 2017, nobody wanted mandates. And now all the airlines want mandates. So, you know, from our perspective, that seems to be coming out as the winner across Australia and New Zealand as what's needed in order to make it happen. Anything from the US or Canada?
And I mentioned briefly production tax credit and investment tax credit, and turn it to Asharda to comment more. Sorry.
No problem at all. I think maybe I'll answer your question with a question as well. I think the difficult part is we are trying to do regulation in Canada, but it seems we can only regulate the fuels that are consumed in Canada. And given our domestic consumption isn't as high as our international consumption, it begs the question: is it even worth the time it takes to regulate that? So, it'd be great to hear from someone like ICAO to say they're going to step in and really do this for all the separate countries.
Yeah,
I guess a lot of countries are in the same sort of situation. I mean, New Zealand, only something like 20% of the fuels are used for domestic flights, 80% for either to Australia or long haul, where hydrogen or electric aircraft will not be used for a long time to come. Yeah. Anyway, I think we must draw this to a close. You know, I'd like to thank the panelists. So for some great conversation, really fantastic presentations. Thank you very much, Jim, Asharda, Luke, Shahana, and Domin. I'd also like to thank the audience for their questions and the active participation during this session. So don't forget, you know, there is still an opportunity to post questions on the conference website. And there's also the wonders.me app that you can use for the next half an hour after we close this session. And also, as this is the last session for us, I'd like to give a big thanks to the ETA Florence team. All the sessions I've attended have run really, really smoothly. It's been really good. So thank you very much, Marco, Ernesto, and Lapo. Been brilliant. Thank you for your support and the support prior to the conference in raising the awareness through advertising, through various media. So thank you very much for that. I think it's been hugely successful. And a final word of thanks to Luke. Luke's worked extremely hard in pulling this together. He's been supported a bit by the organizing committee, and some of the organizing committee are on the panel here, but Luke has been the real driver behind this. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Luke. It's been wonderful, great conversations. We've been some great sessions, some fantastic presentations, and some really thought-provoking information has been shared. So thank you very much, Luke, for all your efforts.
All right.
With that, I'll draw this to a close. So goodbye, everyone. Thank you for participating. Bye.
Thank you all. Good night. Good day.
Thank you.